Usually when we talk about a country's economic poverty, there is this expectation of inevitability.
Right, like it was always meant to happen.
Exactly. Think of it like reading a medical x-ray. You look at a map, you see a landlocked nation with zero natural resources, maybe a brutal climate.
And the Economist just points at the film and says, well, there it is. That is the diagnosis.
Right. But then you step into the world of 20th century economic history, and you encounter a case that completely shatters that x-ray machine.
It really does. It breaks all the rules.
You are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, frankly, terrifying because it breaks every single assumption we have about how nations succeed or fail.
Absolutely.
So today, we are taking a deep dive into what is widely considered the ultimate century-old riddle in economics.
And to crack this riddle, we are using a really foundational piece of research by Alan M. Taylor. He is an economics professor at UC Davis.
And he's a researcher with the NBER.
Yes, the National Bureau of Economic Research. The paper is titled The Argentina Paradox, Micro-Explanations and Macro-Puzzles.
The NBER is basically the gold standard for macroeconomic working papers.
It is. And Taylor's mission here is to dissect a deeply uncomfortable question.
Which is our mission for this deep dive today, too. We're going to figure out what happens when a country sitting at the absolute pinnacle of global wealth, looking at a golden future, voluntarily chooses to smash it.
Smashes it to pieces. There is actually an old, somewhat cynical joke among macroeconomists that Taylor references right at the beginning.
Oh, the four economies joke. I love that
Yeah,
one.
it goes like this. Throughout modern history, there have only ever been 4 kinds of economies in the world.
Okay.
You have advanced economies, you have developing economies, you have Japan, and you have Argentina.
I have always loved that framing because it sets up the sheer weirdness of what we're dealing with.
It really highlights the anomalies. Japan is the anomaly of a relatively poor, isolated nation that skyrocketed to wealth.
But Argentina is the anti-Japan.
Exactly. It is the only notable case in modern history of a country going in the exact opposite direction.
Like if you look at the Madison database, which is that massive historical ledger economists use to track global income over centuries, material living standards advance practically everywhere.
Right. We always talk about the great divergence where rich countries got richer.
And poorer countries grew slower. But Argentina is this glaring, singular exception. It experienced a total catastrophic reversal of fortune.
Let's actually paint a picture of just how rich they were for the listener, because I don't think people fully grasp the scale.
It's hard to imagine now.
In the late 19th century, right up to 1913, Argentina was among the top 5 countries globally in per capita income.
Wait, top 5 in the entire world?
Yes. They were wealthier than almost all of Europe, except for maybe Britain. They were neck and neck with the United States and Canada.
Wow, so Buenos Aires in 1913 wasn't just wealthy. It was literally called the Paris of South America.
It was. You had this massive influx of European immigrants bringing human capital, breathtaking architecture.
Like the Teatro Colón, right? That opera house rivaled anything in Europe.
Absolutely. They were exporting immense quantities of goods, completely integrated into the global financial system.
But if you jump to today, a century later, an Argentine citizen earns roughly 40% of the average income of someone in Western Europe.
That is a staggering 60% relative drop.
60%. That is just mind-blowing.
It is. However, Taylor points out that this 1913 boom, as shiny as it was, had some serious foundational cracks.
So it wasn't quite as robust as the American or Canadian booms.
No, it was incredibly fragile, and that fragility is crucial to understanding the later collapse.
How so? Like, what was wrong with the foundation?
The wealth was built very narrowly. It relied almost entirely on foreign-financed railway tracks pushing into the pampas.
Those are the incredibly fertile plains, right?
Yes. They were extracting massive cereal and beef yields. It was basically a raw material lottery.
Okay, so geographical jackpot.
Exactly. But underneath that, the broader human development metrics were lagging.
When you say human development metrics, you mean things like education and political enfranchisement.
Precisely. The literacy rates and schooling, while very good for Latin America at the time, were trailing behind their rich country rivals.
Rivals like the U.S. or Canada.
Right. And more importantly, the wealth was hyper-concentrated in Buenos Aires and the surrounding province.
So the vast interior of the country was not seeing anywhere near the same explosion of prosperity.
Not at all.
So if I'm understanding the underlying mechanism here, it shows how intoxicating early, easy wealth can be for a nation.
Oh, completely. It creates a false sense of invincibility.
Like when your country's wealth comes largely from the ground, from a geographic lottery rather than broad-based human innovation, it masks deep structural rot.
You assume the wealth is a testament to your brilliant system rather than just a temporary alignment of global commodity prices.
It makes the nation highly vulnerable to external global shocks.
Which, as we know, defined the entire 20th century.
It sounds a bit like the lottery winner who buys the 10-bedroom mega mansion but doesn't bother to figure out how to pay the property taxes.
Or fix the roof. They just assume the initial windfall is permanent.
And then they act completely surprised when the ceiling collapses a decade later.
The mansion was fully built, but the foundation was resting on a very specific global trading environment, staying perfectly stable forever.
Which brings us to the core mystery, the ultimate whodunit of this deep dive.
To solve a murder mystery, you first have to eliminate the usual suspects.
Right. If you want to know why a country is poor, experts usually point to the map or the history books.
But Taylor's paper methodically proves that in Argentina, the map and the history books are lying to us.
Let's talk about those usual suspects.
Yeah.
Economists call them deep determinants, right?
Yes. When a country fails to develop, the academic consensus usually points to causally distant factors. Geography is the classic one.
Like, is the country in a tropical zone with a hostile disease environment?
Like malaria that constantly kills off labor productivity? Yes.
And we can scratch that right off the list. Argentina is a temperate zone.
It has perfect weather for agriculture and settlement.
There were no tropical diseases wiping out the workforce, so geography didn't kill them.
So then the academic world usually pivots to the Ismaglu, Johnson, and Robinson theory.
The famous extractive colonial institutions theory.
For those who aren't familiar, this is a Nobel Prize-winning framework.
It argues that in places where European colonizers couldn't settle in large numbers, they set up extractive institutions.
Basically, systems designed solely to strip mine resources, exploit the local population, and send the wealth back to Spain or Britain.
Leaving a permanent legacy of massive inequality and broken, corrupt governments.
But Argentina completely breaks that rule, too.
Wait, really? Because Latin America is famous for the Spanish encomienda system.
Right, vast land grants given to a few elites, creating brutal inequality.
Are you saying Argentina just somehow sidestepped the entire Spanish colonial hangover?
It's not that they sidestepped it entirely. It's that by the late 19th century, the massive wave of global immigration had fundamentally rewritten their economic DNA.
Oh, interesting. So the paper explicitly tackles this inequality myth.
Yes. Yes, there was land inequality, but Taylor points out that inequality in Argentina around 1914 was actually driven more by the massive influx of poor European immigrants.
And the booming returns on land due to global trade.
Exactly. It was modern capitalist inequality, much like the Gilded Age in the U.S., not ancient colonial stagnation.
By 1900, it was not a struggling extracted colony. It was a democratic settler society.
They had a high literacy rate for the era, and their 1853 Constitution was heavily modeled on the United States Constitution.
Okay, so if we compare the starter packs of Canada and Argentina in the year 1900, they are nearly identical twins.
They possessed the exact same blueprint. Both had temperate climates, massive European immigration, vast frontiers,
And solid democratic frameworks. Canada took that blueprint and built a steady powerhouse.
and Argentina took the exact same blueprint, operated it successfully for a few decades, and then threw it violently in reverse.
So we completely strip away the comforting excuses of bad weather or ancient colonial curses.
They literally held the winning hand.
They had to actively work to lose this game, which means we have to find a force destructive enough to wipe out 60% of a nation's relative income.
What was the actual bullet?
Yeah, what caused this?
To find the bullet, we have to look at the first major micro-explanation Taylor explores.
A violent, unprecedented collapse in trade volumes. We are talking about the locked door.
A lot of people casually assume that as the 20th century progressed, the world just modernized and somehow abandoned Argentina.
But the reality is that Argentina slammed the door shut, locked it from the inside, and threw away the key.
Let's look at the numbers because they are jarring.
Lay them out for us.
Right before World War I, in 1913, Argentina's trade openness, meaning its total imports plus exports divided by its total GDP, was over 80%.
80%. That is massive.
They were one of the most open, globally integrated economies on the planet.
If you are listening to this, imagine your local economy, where 80 cents of every single dollar changing hands is directly tied to a ship leaving or arriving at the port.
They were the global general store for beef and wheat.
But then the Great Depression hits in the 1930s.
The entire world panics, global markets crash, and everyone throws up trade walls.
And Argentina's trade volume plummets to below 20%.
Yes, from over 80 down to under 20.
But wait, during the Depression, everyone locked their doors. The U.S. passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was famously disastrous.
Europe closed up too.
So why is Argentina's drop to 20% the smoking gun if everyone else was doing the exact same thing?
Because the divergence happens after the crisis.
Ah, I see.
After World War II, the rich core economies of the world realized that total economic self-reliance was a disaster.
It had deepened the Depression and contributed to the war.
Right. So through agreements like GATT, which later became the WTO, the West slowly opened back up. Global trade boomed.
But Argentina looked at the recovering, globalizing world and said, no thanks. We're keeping the deadbolts engaged.
They embarked on a massive, decades-long policy era known as import substitution industrialization, or ISI.
So trying to substitute imports by making things themselves.
The core philosophy was, we are going to make absolutely everything ourselves, domestically.
We will not rely on the outside world for manufactured goods ever again.
If you're trying to imagine this, it's like boarding up your house because a Category 5 hurricane is coming.
Which totally makes sense. It's a rational survival response.
But then keeping the boards up over the windows for 70 years while your neighbors are outside having a barbecue.
You're safe from the wind, but you're suffocating in the dark.
And we have to ask why a nation would endure the dark for so long.
It almost always comes down to psychological trauma and fear, doesn't it?
Yes. The extreme volatility of the global markets during the World Wars and the Depression burned Argentina badly.
They realized that their reliance on the primary product lottery, just selling wheat and hoping world prices stayed high, left them at the mercy of outside forces.
The drive for absolute self-reliance makes sense initially as a defensive crouch.
But over decades, that defensive crouch causes permanent muscle atrophy.
And the tragedy is that Argentina was genuinely trying to protect itself.
They wanted to build up their own domestic industries so they wouldn't just be a farm for the British.
But how exactly did they board up the house? They do it by weaponizing their own tax code against their own industrial future.
This brings us to the specific policy mechanism that started the bleeding: toxic tariffs.
By the 1960s, Argentina had instituted average import taxes of about 15% and export taxes of about 15%.
That creates a combined 30% trade distortion on the economy.
Let's walk the listener through how that actually works on the ground, because 30% trade distortion sounds a bit, academic.
Right. Imagine a country desperately trying to build modern factories to industrialize and catch up with the U.S.
But at the exact same time, the government heavily penalizes anyone who tries to actually buy a machine to put inside that factory.
It is an absurd reality.
Carlos Diaz-Alejandro, a brilliant economic historian, pointed out this fatal flaw back in 1970.
What was the fundamental problem?
The problem was that Argentina had a severe comparative disadvantage in producing capital goods.
Meaning heavy industrial machinery, complex tractors, advanced factory assembly lines.
Correct. They were incredibly efficient at growing cows and wheat.
But they did not have the domestic technological base to build robotic assembly lines or high-end machine tools.
So to achieve their dream of industrialization, they desperately needed foreign tools. They had no choice but to import them.
But their own protectionist trade policies, the very policies designed to foster domestic industry, taxed those exact foreign tools into oblivion.
The domestic prices for imported farm machinery became astronomically high compared to world prices.
I want to challenge the premise here, though. Didn't Alexander Hamilton advocate for high tariffs to protect early American manufacturing?
He did, yes.
Didn't the U.S. and Britain both use protectionism to nurture their infant industries before dominating the world?
That is the crucial distinction, actually. Hamilton and early American policymakers were generally protecting the output.
The finished consumer goods, like textiles.
Right. They wanted Americans to buy American shirts instead of British shirts.
So what did Argentina do differently?
What Argentina did was heavily tax the inputs and the capital equipment.
They weren't just taxing the foreign shirt. They were putting massive taxes on the industrial sewing machines needed to make the shirt domestically.
Oh, wow. Okay, so using an analogy, it's like a carpenter trying to start a local furniture business.
Exactly.
The government says, we want a thriving domestic furniture industry. We will protect you from foreign furniture.
But to also protect local tool makers, the government puts a 50% tax on hammers and saws.
Now, the carpenter simply cannot afford a hammer, so he can't build any furniture at all, regardless of the protection.
That is the exact macroeconomic mechanism of their failure. The policy designed to make them an industrial powerhouse is what made it financially impossible for anyone to actually build a competitive industry.
It's mind-blowing. And this wasn't just a minor policy error that caused a slight dip in quarterly profits.
No, Taylor's paper uses some heavy economic modeling to mathematically prove exactly how much this single mistake cost the country.
Taylor and his colleague Antoni Estevado used what is called an open economy neoclassical growth model.
Without getting bogged down in the equations, what does that model do?
It allows economists to simulate how different policies affect a country's long-term, steady-state growth. It isolates the variables.
And when they isolated the effect of these massive trade barriers, what was the damage?
They calculated that maintaining these tariffs permanently wiped out roughly 20% of Argentina's total economic potential.
20%.
In the paper, Taylor describes this as a drop of 0.200 log points.
Okay, pause. What is a log point? I see this in economic papers all the time, but for the listener, what does a 0.2 log point drop actually mean for a human being living in Buenos Aires?
It's a great question. Economists use logarithmic scales when looking at long-term growth because economies compound over time, like interest in a bank account.
So if you just use simple percentages, the math gets distorted over decades.
Exactly. A log point difference is a way to accurately measure the gap in the standard of living between two countries over a long period.
A difference of 0.2 log points translates roughly to a 20% gap in real tangible wealth.
So 20% of your entire national wealth, 20% of your potential hospitals, schools, and wages just vanished into thin air.
All because you made tractors and factory parts artificially expensive.
And the model breaks down that 20% loss even further to show exactly how it vanished.
Break it down for us.
About 2/3 of that damage came from the inflated cost of intermediate inputs.
The raw materials, the specific chemical compounds, the spare parts needed for daily production.
When those are taxed, it acts like a massive negative shock to a factory's daily productivity.
And the rest.
The other 1/3 of the damage came from the artificially high cost of the capital goods themselves, the heavy machinery.
That acts like a sledgehammer to the country's overall savings and investment rate.
Here's where I think this paper completely upends a modern assumption we make about developing nations.
Today, we often think poor countries are poor because they lack know-how.
We assume they don't have the latest technology, they lack education.
And what they really need is a tech transfer program from the West or, a bunch of laptops.
The ignorance theory of poverty. It is a very prevalent assumption, and Taylor addresses it head-on.
He looks at how much total factor productivity, TFP, which is the economist's term for innovation and efficiency, drops when you cut off trade.
When you stop importing ideas from the technology leaders, which in this case would be the US and Western Europe.
And the data proves this ignorance theory is a complete myth for Argentina.
Absolutely. Even using the most aggressive upper bound estimates for how much technology transfer matters, the severing of Argentina's trade volume only accounts for about a 5% drop in their income.
Just 0.050 log points out of the total gap.
This changes everything about how we view the problem.
They had brains. They had a highly educated populace.
Their engineers knew perfectly well how a modern assembly line or a modern tractor worked.
The bottleneck wasn't intellectual. It was purely physical and financial.
They just literally couldn't afford the physical tractors and the intermediate materials.
Because their own tax code made them artificially scarce.
The catastrophic damage came from the ledger, not a lack of knowledge.
It's a vital distinction because it leads us directly into a massive economic paradox.
If tools and machinery were so desperately scarce in Argentina, then the laws of supply and demand suggest something very specific should have happened.
Right. If you are wandering in a desert, water is incredibly valuable. People will pay anything for it.
So if a country is starved for machinery, investing in a factory there should yield insane profits.
So why was the world's money terrified of Argentina? Why didn't investors flood in to build those factories?
This is the crux of the capital problem. Economists look at Argentina and see a severe drought of investment.
A phenomenon they call capital shallowing.
There was a glaring failure to accumulate capital, even when the underlying conditions suggested it should be wildly profitable.
But here is the wild part. For years, the academic economic community was actually fooled into thinking Argentina didn't have a capital shortage.
I was reading this section of the paper and laughing because How does an entire field of PhDs miss something that massive?
It came down to a devastating statistical illusion.
In 1999, two economists, Hall and Jones, published a highly influential study.
They were trying to measure the marginal product of capital across different countries.
The marginal product of capital, or MPK, let's translate that for everyone.
That basically means if I buy one additional machine for my factory, how much extra profit does that specific machine generate?
Exactly. If the MPK is high, it means machines are scarce and highly profitable.
If the MPK is low, it means the country already has plenty of machines, and adding one more doesn't move the needle much.
Hall and Jones ran the numbers and concluded that Argentina's capital problem was incredibly minor.
Explaining only a tiny fraction of their income gap with the U.S.
They concluded Argentina had plenty of capital, they were just using it inefficiently.
But there was a massive flaw in their data set.
Yes, they used the Penworld table, which was the best global dataset available at the time.
But that a particular version of the data set stopped in the year 1988.
So their entire calculation of Argentina's capital efficiency hinged on a snapshot taken precisely in 1988.
If you know anything about Latin American history, 1988 is basically the worst possible year you could pick.
It was an absolute catastrophe.
The government was collapsing under the weight of a catastrophic recession.
The country was experiencing hyperinflation. Factories were literally shutting off the lights and sitting completely idle.
The economy was barely breathing.
So, if you measure how profitable machines are during a massive depression when nobody is buying anything...
And the machines are just collecting dust in the dark? Of course they look worthless.
Precisely. The physical machines existed on paper, but the capacity utilization was near zero.
This single bad snapshot tricked the economic world into thinking Argentina's problem was purely an inefficiency problem rather than a lack of capital.
I love how you framed this earlier. It is exactly like trying to judge a bustling restaurant's true profitability by looking at its cash register on a Tuesday at 3 a.m. during a blizzard.
Right. The register says 0, so you assume the restaurant is a failure.
It's wild that one single bad data year could trick an entire generation of economists into diagnosing the wrong disease.
It really shows the danger of relying on a single cross-section of data.
When later researchers finally took the blinders off, when they updated the data to cover the decades before and after that 1988 crisis, the truth that emerged was staggering.
And the truth is, investing in Argentina actually did offer massive returns. The math worked.
The data reveals that over the long term, from 1960 to 2005, the return on capital in Argentina was consistently 50% higher than investing in the United States.
50% higher. That is a massive premium.
In a normal global market, money is like water. It flows to where the returns are highest.
Money should have flooded into Argentina to capture that 50% extra yield, and it would keep flowing until the gap closed.
But the money didn't flow. Investors took one look at that mountain of cash, that massive potential return, and ran the other way.
I am struggling with the logic here, honestly. If the mathematical models guarantee you make 50% more money by building your factory in Buenos Aires instead of Chicago, why run?
Wall Street has never been shy about chasing a yield. Pure, rational fear. This investment wedge, this 50% premium, explains another massive chunk of the income gap, about 25% of it.
And the reason the premium existed is that investors demanded to be heavily compensated for terrifying existential risks.
We are talking about the fear of outright confiscation.
Let's talk about the history of rare events in Argentina.
We aren't just talking about normal market fluctuations or a bad quarterly earnings report.
Or even a normal recession. We're talking about habitual, systemic, sovereign debt defaults.
Where the government simply refuses to pay its bondholders and dares the international community to do something about it.
We're talking about extreme hyperinflation that magically wipes out the real value of state and private debts overnight.
And it gets even more direct and personal than that. The paper mentions forced conversions of bank deposits, a policy known as pacification.
Yes, if you are a listener, imagine this scenario.
You have $100,000 saved in an Argentine bank account. You worked hard for it. It's your capital.
The government suddenly passes a law saying all accounts are now forcefully denominated in Argentine pesos at a completely artificial exchange rate dictated by the state.
Overnight, your life savings are worth a fraction of what they were yesterday.
Or consider the outright bank holidays where the doors are locked and you literally cannot access your money.
It's like playing high-stakes poker, holding a royal flush, But knowing the dealer might just legally set the table on fire and walk away with the pot before you can collect your chips.
In Argentina, you weren't just battling market competition. You weren't just trying to make a better product than the guy across the street.
You were battling a state apparatus that might suddenly rewrite the fundamental rules of ownership.
And we have to be clear here. Capital is a coward.
It is highly sensitive to unpredictability.
It doesn't matter if you offer a 50% premium. If the investor calculates there is a 20% chance the government simply seizes the asset.
Or inflates the profits away to zero.
And I want to pause here and emphasize something for everyone listening. This isn't a partisan point.
No, it's not about left-wing socialism versus right-wing capitalism.
The paper is completely impartial on the ideology behind these moves. Many different administrations, both civilian and military, engaged in these practices.
It's purely observing the economic physics of the situation.
When state intervention becomes completely unpredictable and property rights are treated as optional suggestions rather than bedrock laws, capital mathematically has to factor in that risk.
And the result is that the entire country gets starved of the machinery and investment it desperately needs to grow.
It is a tragic irony. In an attempt to control the economy, manage crises, and sometimes redistribute wealth in the short term, the state created an environment so risky that long-term wealth creation was strangled.
And it gets worse. Even the money that did brave the flames, the capital that actually was successfully invested in physical machines inside Argentina, evaporated at a terrifying speed.
This brings us to a really fascinating, almost invisible mechanism of poverty: evaporating wealth and systemic misallocation.
Even when a brave investor bought a tractor or built a factory, that physical asset vanished into thin air twice as fast as it did anywhere else in the world.
We are talking about the physical degradation of assets.
In standard economic models, economists usually assume that physical capital machinery, buildings, equipment depreciates at a steady global average of about 6% per year.
Normal wear and tear. You buy a truck, it slowly breaks down over 15 years.
But the data for Argentina is shocking.
Yes. Studies like the one by Boo in 2006, referenced in Taylor's paper, show that in places with similar institutional struggles to Argentina, the actual real-world depreciation rate of fixed assets is between 12% and 16% per year.
Machinery breaks down twice as fast. Why? It's not like the laws of physics are fundamentally different in Buenos Aires.
It's not like the climate is rusting the metal at an accelerated rate.
It comes down to the ecosystem surrounding the machine. Think about public infrastructure.
If the state doesn't maintain the roads because infrastructure funds were siphoned off through corruption or mismanaged,
a brand new, expensive delivery truck will literally be shaken to pieces in half the time. It hits deeper potholes, breaks more axles.
and it connects back to the toxic tariffs we talked about earlier.
Exactly, it's the inability to import spare parts.
If a $100 specialized rubber belt breaks on a $100,000 industrial machine, and you can't import the replacement belt because it's trapped behind a 30% tariff wall,
Or caught in customs red tape, that entire $100,000 machine is effectively dead capital.
it sits idle. It depreciates instantly.
So you have assets physically dying faster. But Taylor also points out that the capital that was functioning was radically misallocated.
Yes, the paper heavily relies on the groundbreaking framework by economists Shea and Klenow on misallocation.
When capital is allocated efficiently by a free market, it flows to the most productive, innovative companies. The best ideas get the funding.
But in an environment heavy with state intervention, closed borders, and cronyism, capital flows to the politically connected, regardless of their efficiency.
Let me see if I have the mechanism right. The highly inefficient factory run by the mayor's cousin gets the cheap, state-subsidized loan and the rare import license for new machinery.
Meanwhile, the brilliant, innovative entrepreneur in the next town over goes bankrupt because they aren't politically connected and can't get credit or import parts.
That is the exact mechanism, and this misallocation destroys macro efficiency.
If capital is systematically given to the wrong people for political reasons, it's the equivalent of destroying up to 50% of the country's potential total factor productivity.
So to summarize the capital crisis, they had trade barriers stopping the water from coming in.
They had confiscation risks, evaporating the water as it poured.
They had bad roads shaking the bucket so the water spilled.
And they had corruption pouring the remaining water onto the floor instead of the garden.
That is the complete multi-layered picture of the investment wedge. It wasn't one single bad policy. It was a cascading failure of the entire economic ecosystem.
But this raises a profound question. How did a sophisticated constitutional democracy allow this to happen?
To understand that, we have to look deeper. We have to look at how they systematically dismantled their own legal immune system.
And this is where the paper gets into institutional history. We usually assume a strong constitution protects a country.
We look at the U.S. Constitution and we see it as this immovable anchor. Argentina had a very similar anchor.
They did. As we mentioned, their 1853 constitution was brilliant.
It was crafted under the intellectual influence of Juan Bautista Alberti, a towering figure in Argentine history.
Crucially, it introduced strong elements of common law, specifically the power of judicial review.
For our listeners who aren't lawyers, judicial review means the courts have the supreme power to look at a law passed by the government and say, no, this violates the Constitution. It is null and void.
It's the ultimate check on government overreach.
Exactly. It was designed to protect the individual and, critically, to protect property rights from the whims of the executive branch or populist mobs.
But Argentina had a dual legal personality. In 1869, they introduced a civil code written by Dalmacio Vélez Sarsfield.
So for a long time, the country operated on a unique hybrid system, a mix of common law, constitutional checks, and civil law administration.
But during the 20th century, as the economic decline really gained momentum, the legal system decayed. How exactly did that happen?
The paper notes a profound structural shift in how power was wielded. The legal system pivoted hard toward the civil law tradition of administrative control.
The pendulum swung aggressively away from jurisprudence and judicial review.
Under both democratic governments and military dictatorships, the executive branch began ruling more and more by decree.
And the courts, perhaps intimidated, perhaps politically aligned, or perhaps just overwhelmed, essentially abandoned their role.
They stopped striking down unconstitutional decrees. They abandoned the defense of property rights against state encroachment.
Because a contract is only as valuable as the court that is willing to enforce it.
If the government decides to seize your bank account and you sue, and the Supreme Court just shrugs and says, well, the administration has the authority to handle economic emergencies, your property rights don't actually exist in reality. They only exist on paper.
The decline of the rule of law maps perfectly onto the timeline of their economic decline.
This wasn't a foreign invasion destroying their institutions. It was an internal surrender.
This breaks my brain. They had the blueprint for success. They literally built the fortress in 1853, complete with constitutional walls and judicial guards.
And then the guards just decided to open the gates, lay down their weapons, and walk away. Why would an entire political class do that?
Why did they open the gates? Because a sudden global shock completely broke their internal politics, permanently handing the keys to the wrong people.
This brings us to the final and perhaps most tragic piece of the puzzle, the political economy of the Depression trap and autarky lock-in.
We talked about the 1930s Great Depression earlier and how it devastated global trade.
But Taylor points out that in Argentina, this temporary external shock had a fatal, permanent internal consequence.
To understand this mechanism, we have to look at a concept known as the Rogowski model, named after political scientist Ronald Rogowski.
The model explains how external trade shocks alter domestic political coalitions based on who holds land, labor, and capital.
Think about it this way. Before 1914, Argentina had extreme natural advantages in global trade. The vast pampas, the huge agricultural exports.
They were land-rich, but relatively labor and capital poor.
So according to the model, the people who owned the land, the agricultural exporters, benefited massively from free trade.
And because they were making the country rich, they held the political power.
Precisely. The political coalition that favored open trade was incredibly powerful because they were delivering the goods.
But when the global markets collapsed in the 1930s, the price of wheat and beef plummeted.
Suddenly, those outward-looking elites were discredited. The wealth stopped flowing.
The external shock weakened the pro-trade coalition. It created a power vacuum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because the gains from trade had been so massive in Argentina previously, the redistributive power of shutting down trade was equally massive.
I need you to explain that. What does redistributive power mean in this context?
It means that when you close the borders and start imposing those 30% tariffs we talked about, you are essentially transferring billions of dollars of wealth from the agricultural export sector to the new protected domestic manufacturing sector.
You are artificially creating a new class of industrial winners, business owners, and unionized urban labor who rely entirely on government protection to survive.
So closing the borders allowed inward-looking protectionist political factions to seize massive political and economic power.
The shock of the Depression empowered them.
Yes, the global shock empowered populists and protectionists.
And once they had that power, and once they had built an entire political coalition funded by the wealth redistributed through tariffs and closed borders, they never wanted to undo it.
They created the closed loop of self-serving protectionism.
So even after World War II, when the US and Europe realized protectionism was a mistake and opened back up to create the modern globalized world, the Argentine politicians in power looked at that and said, well, no.
If we open up, our protected, inefficient domestic industries will collapse. Our political donors will go bankrupt, our union supporters will lose their jobs, and we will lose the next election.
Exactly. It is the tragedy of path dependence. A short-term emergency response to the Great Depression calcified into a permanent political identity.
The vested interest in keeping the country closed became significantly more powerful than the broader, diffused national interest in opening up and growing the economy.
It's like having a brutal winter storm cause a citywide power outage. A family is freezing in their home, so they do what they have to do to survive. They light a trash can on fire in the middle of the living room.
They huddle around it. It saves them in the short term.
But they get so used to the warmth of the trash fire, and whoever controls the supply of trash becomes so powerful in the family dynamic that even when the grid comes back on a week later and the neighbors turn their lights on, this family refuses to flip the switch.
They just keep burning trash in the living room for decades while the house slowly fills with toxic soot and rots around them.
That is a phenomenal, albeit deeply tragic, way to visualize the political lock-in.
And the soot in that living room is the hyperinflation, the capital flight, the decaying infrastructure, and the 60% drop in relative income that defined Argentina's 20th century.
Which brings us to our final thought for today and why this paper matters so much right now.
The ruins of Argentina's economy aren't just an interesting history lesson about a country in South America. They are a glaring, terrifying warning siren for the world you and I live in today.
That is the ultimate takeaway from Taylor's paper. Argentina spent 100 years executing the most painful, drawn-out policy lesson in modern history.
They proved what happens when a nation that thrives on global integration reacts to a sudden economic crisis by embracing protectionism, closed borders, and populist wealth redistribution.
And if you are listening to this on your commute or at the gym, I want you to think about how familiar this sounds.
Every time there's a global shock today, a financial crisis, a pandemic, a supply chain breakdown, you hear politicians from all sides demanding that we close the borders.
Slap massive tariffs on imports, build absolutely everything here at home, and attack the property rights of elites or foreigners.
It sounds incredibly popular and comforting in the short term. It feels like taking back control from a chaotic world.
But the Argentine mirror shows us the long-term mathematical reality of those choices.
It shows us that capital is a coward, that taxing machinery kills industrialization, and that once you build a political coalition based on isolation, it is almost impossible to break it.
Exactly. And I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up.
We've just spent the last hour dissecting how 20th century Argentina broke its economy. They did it by using physical borders and physical force to trap and tax physical machinery.
But look at our world today. We live in a world of borderless digital assets, remote work, decentralized finance, and artificial intelligence.
That's a fascinating pivot. Where are you going with this?
Well, if a country tries to execute the Argentina playbook today, if they try to confiscate wealth or tax capital goods into oblivion to fund a populist agenda, could they even do it?
Right. Capital isn't just a physical tractor sitting in a port anymore. It's lines of code on a blockchain.
Or an algorithm stored on a server in Iceland, or a remote worker who can move to Portugal tomorrow.
Will the next great economic collapse even look like Argentina's? Or will it happen in a completely invisible digital way?
A silent evaporation of wealth that we haven't even learned how to measure yet.
A profound question. Capital will always find a way to flee unpredictability. How it flees in the 21st century might just be the defining economic story of our time.
It really might be.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Argentina Paradox. Keep questioning the map, keep questioning the easy answers, and we will see you next time.